episode from the Talmud I'm going to do today is a very, very complex piece of Talmud. Complex for a huge amount of reasons, and it might actually even take us more than 1 week to go through this this very complex piece of Talmud. So I'm going to make a start. It just on a narrative level, it's fascinating, but there are so many halachic and historic issues arising from it. So I'm just warning you that it's not like this series contains self-contained packages of marvelous information with a message and so on. There's lots of messages in here, but we might have to stretch this over a couple of weeks, even just this particular one. So I'm going to learn a very famous piece of Talmud. When I say famous, a lot of people are not aware of it, but it is famous amongst those who trawl through the sea of the Talmud looking for extremely unorthodox episodes or behavior of the rabbis who comprise the chief personalities of the Talmud. And it is located right at the end of the tractate known as Baba Kama, which deals with damages and torts. And on page 117a, Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, those of you who want to follow me, I've obviously got the Gemara right here, but we couldn't organize for the page to come up, besides which that might alienate some people. It's a very big block of Talmudic text, so I'm just going to go through it here. And at the end of Baba Kama, the rabbis are talking about the laws of what we call MESIRAH. MESIRAH is a concept whereby a person literally hands over the life or the property of another Jewish person to some kind of authority, whether it be a government, whether it be local landlords, whether it be the local mafia, who are searching out property. And if you hand over the property of another Jew, let's say the government comes to you and they say, do you know anyone who's got some silver in their house? And you said, you hide your own silver, but you say, go and knock on Chaim Shmerel's door because he's got some silver, and the government comes and takes it. Then basically you're obligated for the loss of that silver, even though you personally didn't take it, but you're responsible for the government or for the ruling thugs who've come and taken it. And there's a general assumption that non-Jewish governments are not particularly protective or considerate of the property of Jews. This, of course, is true right from the Talmudic ages right through the medieval times. Today, it's a little different in countries like Australia, where everybody, even Jews, are protected by the law, one assumes. But in those days, it was a very serious business, the whole concept of MESIRAH. And a number of the laws of MESIRAH, astonishingly, are worked out from this Agadic episode. So that's just a background, what the Talmud has been talking about by the time it gets to this point on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin on page 117. And they bring a number of cases where they show different facets of the concept of MESIRAH and the concept of what a person is obligated for if they have handed over the property of someone else to the authorities. And then the Talmud just embarks on this really just phenomenally astonishing story that has really 3 parts to it. And I'm going to just try and unpack the first part of this story. So please bear in mind that when we talk about this, this is really just the first part of this narrative. I thought for a little bit that I might go through the entire narrative on a superficial level, but I think actually we'll break it up and we'll discuss it as we go along, and we'll see how far we get today, and it'll be to be continued next week. All right. On the subject of MESIRAH, on the subject of handing over someone else's property, Hahu Gavra. So the Talmud starts to tell you that there was a dude, there was a person, a man. He wanted, this is obviously in Babylonia, which today we call Iraq, in the great Pale of Jewish settlement that was happening in the 3rd and 4th centuries between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Hundreds of committed Jewish communities were living there. It really was a very dynamic center of the Jewish world. Without a doubt, the kind of leading community of the diaspora, the whole community of Babylonia. So this particular individual wanted to show the authorities the straw of his neighbor. Now, the reason it would appear that the Talmud doesn't say why why the government was particularly interested in straw, but perhaps one of the reasons why the Talmud brought this is to show that even something as cheap or as unimportant as straw is still subject to the laws of MESIRAH. So this individual wanted to show his neighbor's straw to the government and say, oh, he's got some straw in his shed, why don't you go and take that? So utterly made a Rav. So he came, or perhaps he was coerced to come before the BETH, the ecclesiastical court of Rav. Now, Rav, as we know, this is the great Rav, his name was Amoraic, who had studied under the very last teachers of the Mishnaic period, of the Tannaitic period in the land of Israel. He himself had been born in Babylonia, but he went and, as a young man, and studied in the land of Israel and became a great scholar, the greatest scholar of his generation, really, but he didn't quite make it into the Mishnaic period. He came back to Babylonia, and as those of you who would know, that series we gave a couple of years ago, Chazal and the Age of Empires, and also we looked a little bit in the Gaonic period. Rav was the founder of the Great Academy of Surah, one of the great academies in Babylonia, and just an enormous sage and dominant personality of that era. So obviously he had a court. And one of the interesting things about this particular Talmudic piece, apart from anything else, is that we can kind of date it as to where it's meant to be. There's been quite a lot of critical work done in the last few decades on this piece of Talmud, and we might touch upon that a bit later, but for the time being we can kind of date it that it's probably happening sometime around the early 240s. So Rav has been back in Babylonia for 20 years now. He's established Surah, he's established his authority in Babylonia. He's got this very, very important ecclesiastical court, and this individual who has declared that he wants to, or that he was suspected that he was going to show someone else's straw to the government, is brought before the BETH. Amalei, so Rav hears all the details to do with this, and he says to this individual, Lo techve velo techve, you will not show him, you will not show him. In other words, based on all the circumstances here, there's absolutely no permission for you to show the straw of your neighbor to the local authorities. 100% not. You're not allowed to do that, because it doesn't matter how insignificant the object is. If it belongs to another Jewish person, you are not allowed to surrender the information about that property to the government if they are looking for it. Now, just one note of that, because one of the reasons why I chose this text is that the laws of MESIRAH are sometimes a little subject to misinterpretation today. So it's probably quite important to clear this up, because HALACHA itself, much later on in medieval and late medieval halachic codifications, they use the story that we're about to discuss as a source text for a number of the laws relating to the concept of MESIRAH, the concept of handing over another Jew to the authorities or another Jew's property to the authorities. And it is the universal opinion of halachic authorities today that the laws of MESIRAH do not apply to someone whose behavior forms criminal nuisance. That is, that they are, for example, and in the famous case that's often quoted, that if someone is guilty of, say, offences such as serious sexual offences, such as abusing children and so on, and I don't need to go into that to talk about those issues. They're very famous in current debate at the moment. But the laws of MESIRAH do not cover a person in that case. And if you're aware in any Jewish institution or Jewish community that someone is acting in that way, you have an obligation to inform the police and to inform the local authorities. So we need to clarify that when we talk about the laws of MESIRAH, we're not talking about cases like that. However, the Talmud and later halachic authorities are very, very particular about Jews' relations with the governing authorities, particularly in ancient and medieval times, and you're not allowed to surrender the property of another person. So Rav tells him, you can't show the government where your friend's straw is, or your neighbour's straw is. So this chap stands up in the court, and he says, Amale machvino machvina. I'm going to show him. I'm going to show him. In other words, provocative and deliberate and willful intent to disobey the directive of the BETH. And he says, I'm going to show him. Once again, relevant to today, and even relevant in an Australian context. And I don't think that I'm going to be too controversial if I say that in recent years, even in this country, it's gone as far as the Supreme Court of New South Wales and even the High Court of Australia. The issue of whether or not someone has it can be empowered within a Jewish community to basically flick the forks at a Beth Din and say, I'm not going to obey your summons. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. So all of these issues remain relevant. In this particular case, once again, the Talmud is showing someone who has a willful disregard for the instructions of the Beth Din. This person says, not the government or whoever it is looking for straw, and I want to be a good citizen, and I'm going to show the government where that chap's straw is held. Now, the Talmud tells us that as this person stood up to willfully tell Rav, the greatest sage in Babylonia, that he didn't care about what he was being told and he wasn't going to listen, he was going to do the opposite. Yativ Rav Kahana Kamei the Rav. So there was another great rabbi in Babylonia called Rav Kahana. There are several Rav Kahanas mentioned throughout the Talmud, and scholarship is not 1,000% sure which Rav Kahana this is. We have a basic idea that it's one of two possible figures that are referred to as Rav Kahana, and there are stories, maybe even this one, which kind of conflate the two personalities. But we do know that this great sage Rav Kahana was a student colleague of Rav, and it was not unusual for high-level student colleagues to be sitting in the Beth Din as part of their vocation and part of their studies and so on, and they would be kind of like an assistant dayan. They would be like an assistant judge of this court. So Rav Kahana was sitting there at the time that this chap made this declaration that he was not going to follow the dictates of the Beth Din. So Yativ Rav Kahana coming to Rav. Rav Kahana was sitting in front of Rav, and Shamte Lakue Mine. Rav Kahana, when he heard this man say, I'm not going to do what you're going to tell me, I'm going to do the opposite, and I want you to imagine that this happens in the Beth Din today, he jumped up, ran over to this fellow, and ripped out his windpipe. He killed him. I mean, other commentaries say that ripping out his windpipe is a bit graphic. That's what the Talmud actually says. So kind of he broke his neck. In any event, he killed him. Other commentators come along and say he didn't mean to kill him. Others say, yes, he did mean to kill him. Whilst that might be shocking, and in fact, it would be shocking today. You can imagine that if reports of this kind of behavior were emerging in a Beth Din today in Australia, you would have heard about it in the AJN, no doubt, but people would be a little hesitant to go to Beth Din if in fact that sort of thing was happening. But nevertheless, this particular episode, and why I call it an unorthodox episode, is actually used as a source for later halachic authorities for the idea that MESIRAH, handing over the life and property of Jews to non-Jewish authorities, was considered so seriously that it was regarded as a reasonable pretext for killing someone on the spot. And as some people even want to translate that to today, there is a flow-on between the idea of MESIRAH, of handing over to the authorities, and the idea of rodef, the idea that there is someone, you can have a license to kill someone that is about themselves to commit a capital crime. And all of these issues rise to the fore, but none are as shocking as the fact that this assistant judge jumped up and killed this defendant in court. So Kare Rav in Levay, so Rav sitting there watching this, the first thing he says is that it reminds him of a verse in Isaiah. I mean, you can imagine that he's sitting there and his assistant Diana's just killed the defendant, and he says, you know, that reminds me of a verse. And it's a verse from Isaiah. Banayich ulfu, your children have fainted. Shachvu b'rosh kol chutzot, they're lying at the heads of all the streets. Ketom michmar, like an ox caught in a net, like a wild ox, a wild animal caught in a net. And Rav says, what's the meaning of this? Ma tozeh, just like this wild ox. Kevan shenafal b'michmar, since he has fallen in the net. Ein merachmin alav, no one has mercy on him. Af mamon shel Yisrael, also the property of Jewish people. Kevan shenafal b'yad ovdei kochavim, once it ends up in the hands of the Gentiles, ein merachmin alav, no one has mercy on it. Now, ein merachmin alav could also mean that no one should have mercy on this defendant. By saying this verse and giving this interpretation, he is in fact providing an approbation, an approval of Rav Kahana's behavior. None of the commentaries on the Talmud, there are many commentaries on the Agaric sections of the Talmud, and especially this particular Agaric section because it has halachic consequences. None of them question the fact, amazingly, and that's why from our perspective today it's a bit unorthodox, none of them question the fact that Rav Kahana was entitled to kill this defendant on the spot. They all go into different aspects of this kind of the consequences of this behavior, but no one questions the right to kill him because they say that he had willfully defied the instruction of the BETH, and he was about to hand over the property of Jewish people to the non-Jewish authorities, and he deserved to die, and Rav Kahana killed him. And that just seems very straightforward for all the halachic authorities, amazingly for our sensibilities today. But sometimes we have to get into the mindset of the Talmud to really work out what's going on. Now, here comes an absolutely fascinating statement, because Rav then turns around and says to him, Amalei Rav, Kahana, he says to him, and this has actually caused a number of, I noticed that there were a number of different shiurim on this Agarata online, and most seem to, in my humble opinion, misread the Gemara here, because it looks like it says Amalei Rav Kahana, those of you who are following, but it's actually Amalei Rav. Rav said to him, Kahana, listen, Adaitna, until today, Havu Parsai, the Persians were in charge. Until recently, the Persians have been in charge. And they weren't particularly worried about murder. Vahashta, now Ika now we have the Greeks. I'll discuss that in a second, what that means. The Kaptu Ashvichud Damim. They're particular about murder. They're actually. It reminds me. It's like when the when the Victorian police say, this month we're going to be focusing on seatbelts. Well, Rav saying to him, look, the current government they're focusing on murder as a thing. So you might want to, we might need to do something about this. And what that really means, and when we look at this historically and we try to unwrap Rav's statement that he's making, that there's been a change of authorities, analysts of the Gemara and historians are enabled by that to be able to pretty much locate what Rav is talking about, because in the 220s, of course, is the great shift in regime in Babylonia between the Parthians, who Rav clearly refers to as the Persians, and the rise of the new Sassanid Empire under Ardashir I, and followed by Shapur I, and so on, and we've discussed that elsewhere. This is a big sea change in Persian, Babylonian political regimes, and although the Sassanids were not Greeks, he refers to them here as Yuvanim, but it's clearly not the Greeks. So the statement that the Persians were here, now the Greeks are here, would have been correct 500 years earlier, when Alexander the Great defeated Persia, but that's not what he's referring to here. He's referring to the fact that the Sassanids have taken over the regime, and they have taken away from us, because we know this historically, is that under the Parthians, Jewish communities had the authority to apply their own capital punishments within their own communities. So if someone died in a legal process within the Jewish community, the government was not going to investigate that. They would say the Jews know what they're doing, they have authority to govern their own community, and we're not going to interfere. But now the Sassanids do not allow us that privilege, and they don't. We don't have that authority anymore, and capital cases need to be brought before the Sassanid authorities. And that's where they're going to start looking and seeing what's going. And in fact, he even says to them, they're particular now about killing people. Va'amri maradin, that they would say, especially in this particular case where this individual wanted to show the authorities someone else's property and we kill them, they will say that we are in fact rebelling, that we are rebelling against them, and that's not going to be good. And then he gives him some advice, and he says to him, this is really where the relevance starts to be frightening. He says to him, Kum sak la'arad Israel, go immediately to the land of Israel. In other words, I don't know if you could imagine such a situation, that someone commits an act or an atrocity or some kind of dodgy situation in the diaspora, and the first thing they do is they jump on an El Al plane to Israel, and they go and live in Israel and get away from the authorities here, and you'll be safer in Israel. That could never happen today. But Kum sak la'arad Israel, get up and go to the land of Israel. Now, before we go further in the story, and this is really only the first part, and as I said, you know, even if we spend this entire 4-week series just on this particular agadic narrative, we wouldn't really get to all of the underlying issues. But there is, since we do have the luxury of doing this in a little bit of depth, I just want to highlight, especially for those who've got the page open, a very interesting Tosafot on the page, where they refer us here on the subject of the statement of Rav that now the Greeks are in charge, what we understand him to mean the Sassanid Empire, but now the Greeks are in charge. And so Tosafot refers us to another Talmudic passage in Gittin. And in that passage in Gittin, there is a similar kind of a story. What they're talking about is that two great sages, they're sitting in Rabbi Baruch, is sitting in Babylonian. They're having a discussion. What that discussion is interesting itself. If you go to the Tractate of Gittin, 16b, and while they're having the discussion, a Zoroastrian fanatic, Zoroastrianism being the religion of the time, and the Sassanids, when they came in, were very frum. And those of you familiar with the history, Sassanid history of the 3rd century, will know the role played by religion and various religious revolutions that were had within the early Sassanid dynasty. So a fanatic Zoroastrian runs into the Bet Midrash, he runs into where they're studying, and he grabs the lamp, he grabs the fire, and leaves them in darkness, and he runs out because fire is holy to the Zoroastrians. And the rabbis were claiming, Rabbi Baruch says that, it says to Hashem, it says to God, would that we were living in the shadow of the descendants of Esau, or in your direct shadow, rather than with these Persians. Meaning that the Romans would have been preferable to living with the Persians. That itself is such a phenomenally interesting historiographic remark, because we know that life in the Roman Empire for Jews during this period and subsequent periods certainly wasn't a picnic. So you can imagine what he meant when he was living in Persia under these levels of fanaticism. And using that episode, Tosfot is trying to help us understand the statement of Rav about what's happening. So there was a time of tremendous instability. And therefore, and of course, in the land of Israel, during the 3rd century, the first half of the 3rd century is still very much within the Roman Empire. And things were both better and worse in different ways for Jewish communities there. The great rabbi at the time in the land of Israel was Rav Yochanan, the overwhelmingly dominant sage in the land of Israel, who had opened his yeshiva in Tiberias. And that is where Rav Kahana is going to go. But he says to him, Rav says to him, before you go, V'kabil alach, and accept upon yourself, in other words, I'm telling you as your teacher, accept upon yourself, D'lo tikshele Rabbi Yochanan sheva shnim. Don't ask any questions, even though you're a great sage. When you go there and you're going to enter into their academies of study, you're not going to ask any questions for 7 years. For 7 years, you're going to just be quiet and keep to yourself. And one of the reasons behind this note, commentators, is because Rav Kahana was not guilty of murder, given that he was legally justified in killing this defendant, but he may have been slightly guilty of rashly making judgment in front of his own teacher, Rav, and jumping up before Rav had the chance to pronounce the HALACHA. In any event, Rav knows that Rav Kahana needs to keep a low profile, so he says, when you go to Israel, go under the radar. You're a very big scholar, you're hard not to notice, but you're going to have to keep quiet for 7 years. And what we're going to find out next week is just what happens when Rav Kahana turns up in the land of Israel and goes into the academy of Rabbi Yochanan, and just how difficult it was for him to keep quiet. And I hope that as many of you will join us for this fascinating Gemara that we will continue to unpack. And I can tell you now that it's going to get, if you haven't looked at it, you'll find out that it gets wilder than your imagination. So I look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the talk. For episode notes and transcripts, or to learn more about David's next classes and projects, visit davidsolomon.online. You can also find David on Instagram or Facebook. Thank you. We hope to see you again soon.